Welcome, everyone. We'll start with a mantra. Om Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagadgurum. Welcome to session 5 of our ongoing workshop on the Bhagavad Gita. So last time we went up to shloka 14 of chapter 2, if you recall, right? And the question that arose after 13, so 12 and 13 are telling us that, oh, Arjuna, Krishna is saying, you should fight. You shouldn't worry about all this, being killed or killing people, because it's a righteous war. Not that Krishna is saying it's good to murder. It's not that. But you're fighting on the just side of a war. And even when you kill the body, the inner soul doesn't die, right? Because the soul is eternal and indestructible. Then suddenly, Krishna in shloka 14 seems to shift gears and says, anytime your sense organs make contact with sense objects, you should just endure them, whatever results from it, whether it's pleasure or pain or heat or cold. And then I asked the question, how is this not a non sequitur from the previous shlokas? What is the logical justification for shloka 14 coming after? These shlokas about our true nature as the soul rather than the body mind. And so what was the answer? If any of you are diligent enough to remember?
Because we are not the body of.
Very good. What are we? So what's the point in enduring these sense pleasures and sufferings at the sensory level?
They're all transient anyways, and they are experienced
That's true.
Through the body, which
Yeah.
doesn't last long. So
yeah.
Anyway, we are not experiencing.
Okay, but by doing it, by enduring the heat, cold, happiness, sadness, what's the result? What's the benefit of doing that? Why bother with this practice encouraged by Bhagavan Krishna in shloka 14? This is the key.
To reduce body identification.
Yeah. To reduce body identification, ultimately eliminating body consciousness and identifying with our true nature as eternal souls, which are united with God, right? This is the point. And Bhagavan Krishna himself says as much in the very next shloka. So let's start with that. Let's look at the app, please. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we're working off an app which you can find on your App Store or Android Google Play. If you type in Gita Aurobindo, it's a Vande Mataram app. Okay, so please go to shloka 15 of chapter 2. I'll repeat the first pada and then you repeat. Yam hina vyathayantyete purusham purushashabha samadukha sukham dhiram somritatvaya kalpate. Okay, so let's look at the Anvaya. He Purusha Rishabha. Krishna is addressing Arjuna as a bull among men. Samadukha Sukham Dhiram, the wise person, Dhiram, who is equal in unhappiness and happiness, Dukha and Sukha. Yam Purusham, Ete, so that person that wise person, and then Ete is referring back to the previous shloka, those heat, cold, pleasure, pain, resulting from the contact of sense organs with sense objects. So to that wise person to whom these things are not, it's hard to explain the grammar here, but the basic idea is that person who is not troubled by heat and cold, pleasure and pain resulting from the contact of sense organs with sense objects, what happens? Saha amritatvaya kalpate. He or she is fit for immortality. But this is just kind of a metaphorical way of saying the same thing that we just talked about, which is that by enduring all of these hardships at the mental and physical level, you gradually erode your consciousness, your body consciousness, your identification with the body mind, and eventually you realize your true nature as the Atman, as the eternal soul. And because it's eternal and immortal, that in that sense you qualify for immortality. Ultimately, you attain liberation from the cycle of rebirth. And let's remember how to look at Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the verse. It's the second button on the bottom, second from the left. Let's read that. Whoever is subject to grief and sorrow, a slave to the sensations and emotions, occupied by the touches of things transient, cannot become fit for immortality. These things must be born. Do you know what's B-O-R-N-E, what that means? It's not B-O-R-N. What is the difference between B-O-R-N and B-O-R-N-E?
Yeah, bear, yeah.
Good, endured, bear. Until they are conquered, till they can give no pain to the liberated man, till he is able to receive all the material happenings of the world, whether joyful or sorrowful, with a wise and calm equality, even as the tranquil eternal spirit secret within us receives them. To be disturbed by sorrow and horror, as Arjuna has been disturbed, to be deflected by them from the path that has to be traveled, to be overcome by self-pity and intolerance of sorrow and recoil from the unavoidable and trivial circumstance of the death of the body. This is un-Aryan ignorance. It is not the way of the Aryan climbing in calm strength towards the immortal life. Okay, so that's basically what we were talking about. Do you have any questions about the commentary?
What is Aryan?
Aryan here is not like it's just the basic idea is it's a certain kind of level of spiritual culture in India, especially represented by the Kshatriya caste in this case, because Krishna is addressing Arjuna, who's belong to the Kshatriya caste. Okay, so let's go to the next shloka. This is a very cryptic shloka and highly contested shloka. There have been many different interpretations. So let's look at this somewhat carefully. And it's a very abstract shloka also. So 2.16. Nasato vidyate bhavo na bhavo vidyate satah ubhayorapi drishtontas vanayos tattvadashibhihi. Okay, so let's look at the Anvaya first. And here, because as I said, there are many different interpretations of the shloka, translation becomes tricky because there are multiple translations of some of these key words. But in any case, asataha bhavaha na vidyate. Okay, so asataha here, so bhavaha is in the nominative case. I don't want to go into the details of the grammar here. Okay, but the basic idea is for the asat, okay, there is no, na vidyate means there is no bhavaha. For the asat, there's no bhavaha. There's no, you can say, here it depends on the commentary. So let me just mention. So, okay, well, let's begin with Shankara's commentary. Shankara has a long commentary on the shloka, and it's very sophisticated and impressive. And he basically claims that the entire Advaita philosophy is contained in this shloka. How does he arrive at it? What he says is, so look at the first quarter, the first pada. Na asataha vidyate bhavaha. Okay. And he says asat here is anything that is changeful. Anything that changes, that is not eternal. He says for anything that is changeful, there is no ultimate existence. So he interprets na vidyate bhavaha as it's ultimately non-existent. Anything changeful, anything you see in this world, this table will eventually change, this laptop will eventually change. Therefore, from the ultimate standpoint, none of this exists, which means this entire world becomes non-existent from the ultimate standpoint. This is from Shankara's standpoint of Advaita Vedanta. And then the second pada, na bhavo vidyate sataha. So here, let's go back to the Anvaya. Sataha tu abhavaha na vidyate. Regarding the sat, things that are eternal, unchanging. Abhavaha na vidyate. So here, it can never not exist. It's eternal, so it always exists. This is the basic idea. So now what Shankara says is, this is a way to summarize Shankara's interpretation. That first pada, nasato vidyate. Okay, first of all, do you any of you know this famous formula, little formula to capture in encapsulated form Shankara's Advaita Vedanta? The gist. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. So this first pada corresponds to which one? Good, yeah. There's 50-50 chance, but she got, okay, good. So exactly. Nasato vidyate bhavo is Jagat Mithya. And na bhavo vidyate sataha, the sat can never go into non-existence, can never not exist. Corresponds to Brahma Satyam. So Shankara and his followers claim that the entire Advaita philosophy is contained in this shloka. If you want details on this, Sarvapyanji has an entire 1 to 1.5 hour lecture just explaining this shloka from the standpoint of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, which is very nice. Okay. And then, okay, but that's Shankara. Now let's look at Ramanuja briefly. Ramanuja, as I think we've discussed in the past, he was the founder of a bhakti school of Vedanta called Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, qualified non-dualism. And because of the bhakti school, he believed that Brahman was personal rather than impersonal, unlike Shankara. And he did not say that this world was unreal, because the world is a creation of God and is a manifestation of God. So the world is real. So how does he interpret the same word? He can't interpret it as Jagat Mithya Brahma Satyam. So he interprets these words slightly differently. Asat, according to Ramanuja, means the body-mind. And it's not that they're unreal, it's that they don't last forever. One day they'll perish. This is the basic idea. They're impermanent. You see the difference? Impermanence does not necessarily entail unreality. But according to Advaita Vedanta, if something is impermanent, it makes it ultimately non-existent. But Ramanuja parts ways at that point. And he says, no, it's impermanent. The body and the mind are impermanent, but that doesn't mean that they're unreal. And then, so then the second pada, na abhavaha vidyate sataha. The sat here is the jivatman, the eternal soul, according to Ramanuja. And that eternal soul can never perish. This is the meaning of the second pada, according to Ramanuja. And I'm not going to tell you which one is better. That's up to you. You know, each of you should think for yourself. And there are many other interpretations. Sri Aurobindo gives, let's look at Sri Aurobindo's. So he says, this is just where it says Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. The app is, it's a little weird. It's actually his translation, right? It's not really interpretation. So that which really is cannot go out of existence. Now, what he's doing is, don't get confused. He's first translating the second pada. See that? That's why it could be confusing. It's not as literal as we might like. Just as that which is non-existent cannot come into being. So this is the first pada. That which is non-existent cannot come into being. Okay, so this one is like, maybe you can say this is a kind of a third interpretation alongside Shankara's and Ramanuja's. It's not quite the same as either of them. And one problem I have with it, it seems to be a little bit like telling the obvious. That which really is cannot not exist, and then that which is non-existent cannot come into being. It seems kind of obvious. So that's why both Shankara and Ramanuja, even though, see, depending on context, bhavaha in Sanskrit and sat, they have very similar meanings. But in order to make the shloka say something meaningful and profound, they give different meanings to sat and bhava and asat and abhava. You know what I mean? Okay. Now, second line, this is also cryptic. Ubayorapi drishtaha antaha tu anayoho tatvadashbihi. So let's look at the Anvaya. Anayoho ubhayoho. Between these two things, what are the two things? Can anyone guess? A little hard, actually, especially if you. What are the Sanskrit terms? It'll be easier to talk about the Sanskrit. The two things here, referring to the previous line of the same shloka. Very good. There you go. She said it very confidently. That's why she's vice president. Okay. So sat and asat, correct. So api, even, antaha. Now here the word antaha is a little bit tricky. Does anyone know what anta usually means in Sanskrit? End. Good. Yeah. Also in Kannada it's the same thing, huh? Okay. Here, the commentators tend to say end won't in a literal sense won't make too much sense, and so they give it a slightly different meaning. Ramanuja, for instance, uses the Sanskrit word nirnayaha, discernment, especially focusing on like discrimination or viveka, basically between what and what. Remember how Ramanuja interprets asat as body mind, sat as soul. So the tattva darshivi, so that means those the knowers of the truth of tattva are the ones who are able to discriminate between sat and asat and say the body mind are these perishable things. I am not the body mind, I am the eternal soul. I'm separate from the body mind. This is the basic idea. Shankara says roughly the same thing, except for him the Atman is not the individual soul, it's the non-dual Atman or pure consciousness, right? Which is common to everybody. Whereas in Ramanuja, each one of us has a different individual soul. And we always remain separate from God. United with God, but still separate. We're not identical to God, according to Ramanuja. Okay, so this is all a little bit abstract and philosophical, but if you have any questions, otherwise we'll move on to the next one. No?
How do we know he's not saying it between coming and going out? How do you know?
Sorry, what's the question?
How do we know that Ubayo is such an asat and not like Bhava and Abhava?
Oh, I see. Well, hi. Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, well, but one can always kind of give different interpretations, and so I don't think you can't rule it out completely, but you have to look at the context and figure out what the best interpretation would be, right? So in this case, everybody, I mean, that's pretty much unanimous. The commentators don't disagree on what the ubhayod, the two things are, sat and asat. Okay, next one, Shloka 2.17. Avinashi tu tad vidhi yena sarvamidam tatam vinasham avyayasyasya nakaschit kartum arhati. Okay. Anvaya. Avinashi tat tu vidhi. So know, Krishna is telling Arjuna, know what? That this Avinashi, that which, so then I have to read the whole thing. Yena idam sarvam tatam. That which pervades this entire universe, know that to be Avinashi. Anyone know what Avinashi means? Indestructible, exactly. Know that to be indestructible, which pervades this entire universe. Asya avyayasya vinasham kaschit na kattumarhati. So this undecaying, avyayasa is avyaya, there's no vyaya, there's no decaying or perishing of this thing. So this referring to this eternal soul. No one in this world is capable of destroying, vinasham, this eternal soul. That's all this one means. So these slokas are starting to become a little bit repetitive. And so there's always this issue of there's a fault in classical Indian literature called punarukti dosha, which means saying the same thing over and over again. But in the case of spiritual texts, scriptures like the Bhagavad Gita, Upanishads often say the same thing again and again about you're the Atma. The idea is that you can justify that repetition because we're so stupid. And because if you just tell us once, it doesn't go into our heads. And so you have to keep hammering. Have you done your homework? Have you done your homework? like you tell a 5-year-old, we're all 5-year-olds from a spiritual standpoint. This is the idea behind Krishna telling Arjuna the same thing in different ways, right? Okay. And the only thing I want to bring your attention to in this shloka, which I think is significant, is this second pada, yena sarvam idam tatam. Because what this seems to imply is, remember how last time we were talking about how each of us has an individual soul, arguably, depends on which philosophy but we seem to think that this natvevaham jatana, that shloka 12 of chapter 2 we were discussing, seemed to be more plausible to take each of us to have an individual soul. Now here, interestingly, you get this, Krishna is saying that this soul pervades the entire universe. Here we seem to be moving towards something more like a universal soul. You see, which doesn't necessarily mean that these individual souls are ultimately non-existent. That would be the Shankarite standpoint. But now suddenly Krishna is bringing into play for I think the first time so far, this idea of a more universal soul, right? Here you're not getting the plural subject saying that there are multiple souls. This soul pervades the entire universe. Okay, so that's the one thing I wanted to point you to. Now, let's look at shloka 18, unless we have questions on this. Any questions? No, okay. So 2.18. Antavanta ime deha nityasyoktaha sharirinaha anashino prameyasya tasmad yudhyasva bharata. Okay. I guess let me, I'm not reading Sri Aurobindo's translation. Let me read Sri Aurobindo's translation first, and then we can do that. So finite bodies have an end, but that which possesses and uses the body, meaning the eternal soul, is infinite, illimitable, eternal, indestructible. Therefore fight, O Bharata. This word illimitable, I really like this word. It's one of Sri Aurobindo's favorite words. You'll find it if you do a keyword search on his complete works, that comes up again and again. But it's a very beautiful word, actually. We'll talk about it because it becomes relevant here when we compare different commentaries. Okay, so let's look at the Anvaya. Anashinaha means imperishable. Aprameyasya, this word is highly controversial. It's been interpreted in different ways by different commentators. Aprameyasya. Of course, it's referring to what? What is being described as anashinaha, aprameyasya, the soul, the eternal soul. Nityasya means eternal, right? Sharirinaha. Sharirinaha is the embodied soul. But this aprameya, what does it mean for the soul to be aprameya? This is what's controversial. So let's discuss that a little bit. So Shankara, first of all, says he's thinking of Indian epistemology, which is a subfield within Indian philosophy. It's also in Western philosophy. It means a philosophical inquiry into knowledge. What is knowledge? What are the sources of knowledge? And in Indian epistemology, they have this what's called pramana theory. There are different pramanas, sources of knowledge. There are different ways that we can come to know things. Some of the main ones are pratyaksha pramana. Pratyaksha means sense perception. It could be eyes, it could be hearing. This is pratyaksha. And then there are others. Anumana means inference, logical inference. Shabda is verbal testimony, which includes, if you ask me, if you're new to an area and I'm a local, you might ask me for directions to the nearest gas station. My verbal testimony. It includes that, but it also includes scriptures. Scriptures are also considered to be verbal testimony, right? So even that has authority if you accept Shabda Pramana. Okay, so this is a little bit of background because the thing is, aprameya, prameya means, in Indian epistemology, means object of knowledge. So what Shankara says is, this Atman is aprameya in the sense of being indeterminable by any of the pramanas, any of the different sources of knowledge. You cannot perceive the Atman with any of your senses. You cannot infer the Atman on the basis just of independent logical reasoning. Of course, you might ask, well, wait a minute, but Shankara was a Vedantin, so he believed in the Upanishads. And he did. But he means this in a slightly different sense. He says that the Atma is Svata Siddha. This is a Sanskrit term he uses, which means that the Atman doesn't have to be, it's never the object of knowledge. It proves itself, it makes itself known automatically, Svata Siddha. It doesn't have to be known through any other source of knowledge. It's self-revealing. Okay? So this is Shankara's interpretation. Ramanuja, this is one of the few places where Ramanuja comes very close to Shankara's interpretation. They don't seem to differ too much. Ramanuja also says, aprameya, the Atman, is aprameya in the sense that it is never the object of knowledge. It is always the subject of knowledge. Knower, rather than that which is known. And the Sanskrit word here then is pramatar. The Atman is always pramatar. It's never prameya, which means object. It's never an object of knowledge. It's always a subject of knowledge. This is also very technical. One question that you might raise is, I mean, is Krishna really thinking in such technical philosophical terms? And we'll leave that an open question. But because these are philosophers writing these commentaries and trying to establish their philosophical schools, they're really kind of like milking these shlokas for all sorts of subtle and technical philosophical meanings. We're going to find that even more in a more extreme form in shloka 20 if we get to that today. We'll see shortly. Okay. So, but look at Sri Aurobindo's translation. I prefer his, to be honest. It's he defines aprameya as infinite and illimitable. See here, the ma. Do you know what ma? Like even maya, the word ma. Do you know what ma means? The dhatu ma. To measure. That's why maya is like something that limits. In that sense, puts a limit to something. So aprameyasya, Aurobindo is interpreting it in this slightly different way. It means you can never put a limit to the Atman. And if anyone's familiar with the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, he would often say, Bhagavan ke kokono iti kora jai na. You can never put a limit to God and say he or she is just this and no more. God is infinite. So Sri Aurobindo is interpreting this aprameya in a completely different, non-technical way, which I find very beautiful, actually. Aprameya, the Atman is aprameya in the sense that it's illimitable. You can never put a limit to it. It's infinite. It always exceeds our ability to grasp it. Okay? Okay. I think that's good enough. So now let's go to any questions before we move on to 19? No. And see, you'll notice because that box is grayed out, it means that Sri Aurobindo doesn't have any special commentary on this. He won't have commentary for a while, actually. Okay, next shloka. Ya enam veti hantaram yaschainam manyate hatam ubhauto na vijanito nayam hantina hanyate. Okay, let's read Sri Aurobindo's translation first. He who regards this, meaning the soul, as a slayer, a killer, and he who thinks it is slain, both of them fail to perceive the truth. It does not slay, nor is it slain. So Anvaya, Yaha, that person, Enam, this soul, referring back to the previous shlokas, the eternal soul, Hantaram Veti, who thinks of it as a Hantaram, a killer or slayer. Yahacha enam hatam manyate, that person, or that person who, this is another person, they're imagining a second person. Yahacha enam, this as hatam manyate, as somebody who's killed or slain. Ubhautau, both of these people are foolish. Na vijanitaha, they are not wise people, they do not know the truth. Ayam nahanti, this ayam is the soul. It neither kills nor can ever be killed. This is the basic idea. Again, Krishna is saying the same thing to beat it into the head of Arjuna. And yeah, because it's saying the same thing, I don't think we have much to discuss unless you have questions. And then we get to the next shloka, which is very interesting, actually. Again, from a philosophical standpoint, commentators do all sorts of funny things with it. Okay, so let's read it first. And by the way, is this the first time that we're encountering the longer poetic meter? It may be. Yeah, so actually shloka is a kind of, if you understand shloka in its very narrow, precise sense, is a type of poetic meter with 4 padas, each of which has 8 syllables. And that's why you get that rhythm. Avinashi tutad vidhi, like that. This one, notice, throws up that whole thing because it's a different kind of meter. I think it's called upajati. It's 11, 11, 11, 11 syllables rather than 8, 8, 8, 8, which is shloka meter. Shloka meter is 8 syllables, 8 syllables, 8 syllables. This is 11, 11, 11, 11. So we have to chant it slightly differently. Najayate mriyate va kadachin. Nayam bhutva. Let's do it sure, like break it up. Nayam bhutva bhavita va na bhuyah ajo nityah shashvatoyam purano nahanyate hanyamane sharire. Okay, first Aurobindo's translation. This, again, what is it this? I hope we all know by this time. Okay, good. This is not born, nor does it die, the soul. Nor is it a thing that comes into being once and passing away will never come into being again. It is unborn, ancient, sempiternal. Sempiternal is a fancy British Victorian word, which just means basically eternal. It is not slain with the slaying of the body. Okay. Anvaya first. Ayam, soul, the soul, this soul, kadachit najayate, was never born. Mriyate vanava, it never died, and it can never die. Now here we get slightly tricky, the next phrase, bhutva bhuyaha na abhavita. So here we get into a kind of a tricky Sanskrit issue. Sorry, what? Yeah, that's a one way of putting it. It doesn't have a past, present, and future. That's true. I mean, literally what it means. Bhutva means having become, having come into being. Bhuyaha means again. Na abhavita. But here there's actually a typo in the anvaya, as far as I'm aware. It should be bhavita. At least on Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. And the thing is, because of the nature of the Sanskrit language, you could theoretically interpret it as abhavita also, but it changes the meaning slightly. This reminds me of a very funny Sanskrit grammar issue. Madhva, he was the founder of a different school of Vedanta called? No, not Vishtadvaita, that's Ramanuja. Oh, come on, Madhva, please. Huh? Dvaita Vedanta, the dualistic school of Vedanta. I hope that most of you are aware of this famous Mahavakya called Tattvam Asi. In which Upanishad? Atri, you should get it. Come on, like this. Okay, Chandogya Upanishad. Tattvam Asi. Thou art that, Brahman, right? Now what Madhva does is very interesting because he doesn't accept the Advaitic idea that we are one with God. So what does he do? He says, notice that in the previous mantra, just before Tattvam Asi, there's a vowel, there's like an ah sound. Okay? Or ah, long ah, like this. So he says, because of sandhi, we should take tattvamasi to mean actually atattvamasi. Thou art not that. Atattvamasi. And you can do it. Obviously it's not very plausible, but technically you can claim that because of the sandhi from the sandhi is carrying over from the previous one. I bring it up because here too, bhutva is followed by this bhavita, right? But because of this long ah, it could also be bhutva abhavita because it's the same. It would look the same in both cases. It would be bhutva bhavita if you read it with the sandhi. So that's why, depending on your interpretation and how you want to play it, you can either interpret it as bhavita or as abhavita. Maybe slightly too technical, but anyway, just the point is that in this case, I think the app is giving a typo here because notice the way Sri Aurobindo translates this phrase, bhutva bhuyaha na bhavita. Sri Aurobindo says, nor is it a thing that comes into being once, that's bhutva, and passing away will never come into being again. Bhuyaha na So that's why I think it's bhavita, because come into being again. It means bhavita. Abhavita means not existent, right? So that's why I think this anvaya is actually, there's a typo here. It should be bhutva bhuyaha na bhavita. Okay. Ayam, soul, this soul, ajaha, it is never born, right? Yeah, birthless, you can say. Birthless, nityaha, eternal, shashvataha. Yeah, it's very similar to eternal. And now we'll raise an interesting question. All these words, they seem to be sort of saying the same thing. Puranaha, but Purana is slightly different. What do you? Ancient, yeah. But again, similar meanings, right? Sharire hanyamane na sharire hanyamane na hanyate. So this is sharire hanyamane is what's called in Sanskrit sati saptami. It's in the 7th case, vibhakti, and it means basically when X. So even when the body is slain, na hanyate, the soul is not slain. This is the basic meaning. Okay. But now, as you pointed out, a lot of these words seem to mean the same thing. Now, again, these commentators were very eager to avoid this punarukti doshaha. They have to prove that every word has a significance. And so Shankara and his followers do this very brilliant thing. They claim that in this shloka, Krishna is denying 6 kinds of change. Krishna is saying that none of the 6 kinds of change that are true of all the things we see in this world, like tables and chairs and laptops, apply to the eternal Atman. Does anyone know what it's called? Shadvikara in Sanskrit. The Shadvikara, okay. And it goes in sequence. Just you'll see, it's pretty obvious actually. And those who have studied life science, first in the Shadvikara, the first kind of change that can happen to any kind of entity is birth. You're born. Second, continuance. If you're born, you live for a little bit at least. Even fireflies live for a certain amount of time before passing away. Then what? Third is growth. Fourth is transformation. You start getting wrinkles on your face, this and that. You might get cancer. That would be, God forbid. Anyway. And then the 5th kind of change is decay. You start decaying. Everyone knows eventually. And then the 6th and final is, can you guess? I hope you can guess this. Death. Right? So these Shadvikara, birth, continuance, growth, transformation, decay, death. Now what Shankara and his followers claim is, brilliantly, is that, you see, all these different adjectives, they're not redundant. What Krishna is doing is negating each of these 6 kinds of change and saying that none of these 6 kinds of change apply to the eternal soul. How do they do this? The first one, I hope, is very obvious. Where in the shloka, in this verse, is the first one, birth being negated? Najayate. Good. I hope that wasn't too hard. But how about the last one? Is death? How is death negated? Where in the? Okay, that's true. But there's also even more direct. Yeah, mriyate, exactly. Na mriyate, the very next word. Najayate is negating the first kind of change. Na mriyate is denying the 6th kind of change. Okay, that's 2 are gone. There are 4 left. Okay, now here it gets a little bit complicated. This long phrase that we've been talking about, Sridhara Swami says that that long phrase, bhutva bhavita va na bhuyaha, is negating the 2nd kind of change. Maybe I could have asked you as a quiz. It would be interesting. Continuance. How do we get negation of continuance? Because bhutva means coming into birth, coming into being. Bhavita va na bhuya. It's not that this is the kind of thing. The Atman is the kind of thing that is born and then continues its existence, right? This is the basic. This is how Sridhara, who is a follower of Shankaracharya, he interprets. He says that phrase negates the 2nd thing. What are left? We have now growth, transformation, and decay. Can you guess which ones will apply to which? It's not very easy. I mean, it's any of them. So which one would that negate? Yeah, I mean, okay, so, it's anybody's guess. So it's not, let me just tell you exactly what. So, okay, so Shankara says, Shashvataha is the negation of decay. And because, in a fridge, things stay fresh in the fridge, right? Shashvata, you can see another way of putting it is that the Atman is ever fresh. It never spoils, it never decays. This is the idea. And then Purano, ancient, is the negation of, so now there are only two left. Transformation and growth. Which one do you think it is? Puranaha. The soul is, huh? No, the other one. So, so growth. Again, but you can see how much of it you can make them correspond to other terms too. Okay. Anyway, so Purana here, according to the Shankara's tradition, negates growth, the third of the 6 kinds of change, because it's ancient. So ancient things don't grow because they're always perfect or something. That would be the idea, I think. And then finally, the only one left is transformation. No, well, it could be obviously, but this one person here, Atari, is suggesting nitya. But the Shankarites say, nahanyate. It can never be killed, because being killed is a kind of transformation. This is the idea. So in any case, again, this question we can ask is, this is ingenious, but is it true that this is what Krishna actually meant? Did he really mean it? Did he have in mind this technical doctrine of 6 kinds of change, and was he really systematically denying each of these 6 kinds of change in this verse? This again, I'm leaving that an open question. All right? Huh? What?
Is like he might be thinking much.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, so Atri is saying it could be possible. Why not? God is omniscient, and so he knows everything. I mean, he knows technical philosophy much better than even Shankara and all these. So maybe. Okay, so let's do one more shloka, and then what we'll do for the first time is we'll conclude with 5 minutes of meditation. I hope that's okay. Okay. Okay, so please go to shloka 21. Veda vinashinam nityam ya enam ajam avyayam katham sapurusha partha kam ghatayati hantikam. Good. Sri Aurobindo's translation. Who knows it? Oh, I see. There's a slight discrepancy between the book I'm using, which is edited by Anil Baran Roy, and the app. I'm going to go with the book because I feel like the app is not quite as reliable. So, okay, I'm going to read Sri Aurobindo's translation of the shloka as mentioned in the book I have. Who knows it as immortal, eternal, imperishable, spiritual existence? How can that man slay, O Partha, or cause to be slain? Okay, it's almost the same, but here in the app, he who knows it as immortal, eternal, imperishable, spiritual existence, how can that man slay, O Partha, or cause to be slain? Actually, the app's translation is a little bit clearer in terms of the grammar. Yeah. Okay. Anvaya. Hey Partha, Krishna is telling Arjuna, O Arjuna, yaha enam avinashinam nityam ajam avyayam veda. That person who knows this soul to be avinashinam, indestructible, nityam, eternal, ajam, birthless, exactly the same stuff as the previous shlokas, avyayam, undecaying, saha purushaha, that person, katham kam ghatayati. So this ghatayati is a special, it's very unique in Sanskrit grammar. They have this thing called nijanta, which means it's like causing somebody to do something. If you just modify the verb in a certain way, you can make it mean, instead of meaning kill, it means causing to kill. Getting somebody killed would be like in the mafia, the mafia don never kills people. He gets, he gets people killed through his underlings, right? So like that. So that's ghatayati here. It's in this nijanta. So it means, so that person who knows the eternal soul, that he himself or she herself is the eternal soul, katham kam ghatati. How can he or she cause anybody to be killed? And who will be killed? Kam hanti. It's a rhetorical question. The idea is not that they're asking who is that Atman killing or that person killing. It's a rhetorical, which means obviously that the person who knows that he is a soul, he cannot kill anybody, and he cannot be killed, and he cannot cause anybody to be killed. As soul, right? That's the idea. Okay. Okay, any questions about any of these slokas before we move on to meditation?
One thing I
Yeah.
just want to, when I thought about it,
Yeah.
there are two different interpretations of like Atman, and
Ramanuja. Individual soul for Ramanuja and the non-dual self in Shankara's philosophy. Yeah.
So, I do follow Advaita.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like, it can be both. There is something like wave particle here, you give like wave and
Yeah.
particle and
Yeah.
so it can be both can be true as well.
Simultaneously.
Simultaneously.
That's a nice point. And I think that's exactly Sri Aurobindo's perspective and Sri Ramakrishna's perspective. I mean, so there's another school of thought which says, why can't both be true? Why can't we all be individual souls? And why can't there also be a universal soul, a non-dual self? And at different levels of consciousness, we can identify with either the individual soul or with the universal soul. And so Sri Ramakrishna used to explain this by invoking a famous shloka attributed to Hanuman, Deha Buddhya Dasosmi. And then what's the next one? Jiva Buddhya Tvad Amshakaha. So Hanuman is addressing Rama. Oh Rama, Deha Buddhya Dasosmi. When I identify with the body, I say I am your dasa, your servant. Jiva Buddhya Tvad Amshakaha. When I identify with the individual soul, I say I'm your amsha. I am a portion of you, a spark of you, something like that. And then what is the second line? Atma Buddhya Tvamevaham iti me nishtita matihi. When I identify with the Paramatman, the supreme universal Atman, then I say I am you and you are me. Right? So again, so Sri Ramakrishna would say all of these different attitudes toward God, relationships with God are true. The attitude of, or the relationship of servant to master, amsha amshi, which means part to whole, radical identity, that I'm one with God. All of these are true at different levels of consciousness, and they're all true. This, I like that suggestion, and that really is, this is part of the reason why I like Sri Aurobindo's approach to the Gita, because I gave a lecture last week in this Ramakrishna monastery in Traditional Canyon, and the title of the lecture was Sri Ramakrishna, the both and avatara. The both and of it. Instead of thinking in terms of either or, either we are individual souls or there's only one non-dual self, Sri Ramakrishna taught, why can't we have both? Right, as Atri is also suggesting. And the same applies for God, right? A lot of these Vedāntic schools for centuries have been debating, is God personal, saguna, or impersonal, nirguna? And then Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, and others, Kashmiri Shaivism, there are other Indian thinkers who say, then why can't it be both? If God is God, truly omnipotent, why can't God, the omnipotent God, be both personal in one dimension and impersonal in another one? You mentioned the particle wave duality thing, but that's it. And if that can be possible in this material world, why can't the omnipotent God be capable of being multiple things at once? This is the idea. Any other questions? Okay, so this has been a stressful week here at USC with a lot of homework and other things. So we'll end every class now with just a 5-minute meditation. So if anyone has been given a mantra, you can mentally repeat the mantra that's been given to you by a guru. Otherwise, we'll use Om. And because all of these shlokas are telling us the same thing and trying to hammer it into our heads, you are not the body-mind complex. You are what? The eternal soul. I think it would be appropriate to meditate on our true nature as eternal souls and meditate on the soul in your heart. This is what Ramanuja calls Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge. Jnana Yoga means different things according to different schools. But for Ramanuja, what Ramanuja says is, before you can have bhakti for God, before you can feel any kind of love for God, which is what we do next. In the next room, we do arati, and right? That's bhakti. But what Ramanuja says is, it's good that we're doing these things, but these are all preliminary practices. We will never feel a spontaneous yearning for God and love for God until we first realize our true nature as souls, separate from the body-mind complex. That's why Ramanuja says, you have to practice Jnana Yoga before Bhakti Yoga. It's the exact opposite of Shankara's philosophy. Shankara says Bhakti Yoga is a preliminary practice to purify the mind, concentrate the mind. Then you practice the higher practice of Jnana Yoga. Ramanuja just reverses it. First Jnana Yoga to be eligible to practice Bhakti Yoga. But it's true actually that you can't really have genuine love for God so long as you identify with the body-mind complex. And just intellectually discussing these shlokas is not enough. That's part of the reason. Oh, I want to mention one thing before our little meditation. Swami Turiyanandaji was a great monastic disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. He did a lot of tapasya in the Himalayas. And one monk came to him and asked Turiyanandaji, you seem to be reading the Gita a lot. He said, yes. And then that monk asked, how do you read the Gita? What's your method for studying the Gita? And he said something very beautiful. He said, I read one shloka of the Gita and I try to put it into practice. And so long as I am not able to practice it completely, I don't move on to the next shloka. This is how a great soul approaches the Gita. It's not intellectually. You read one shloka, you try to internalize it and practice it in your daily life to the point of perfection. Then you move on to the next shloka. But we're not doing that, of course. But at least for these 5 minutes at the end of each class, we can try to put our money where our mouth is and not just intellectually think about being the Atman, but try to really identify for some time with the eternal soul within. Okay? So let's close our eyes. And we'll repeat Om. Let's repeat it out loud 3 times, and then we'll do it mentally. We can repeat. And Om, instead of doing it like Om, 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 very slow Om will be better, actually. It'll help you to calm your mind. And so as long an Om as possible. And try to synchronize the breath as you inhale and exhale. Try to synchronize it with Om. 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 Gently open your eyes. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om.